While traveling overseas, someone asked the question, where do the stories come from? And the answer that was given was, I am the stories. This might sound like somewhat of an arrogant statement, but we all know that every aspect of every story that is told is a part of ourselves, a part of our psyche. But there's a certain French folk tale that tells my story, and I wonder if it's your story too. The young man leading his donkey came into a small town, and with his practiced eye he gazed around, assessing the situation. And there was the town square, the little road leading into town, leading in to that square, the little shop houses that were lined along the road. And then as his gaze moved around, it came to a large poplar tree standing in front of an iron gate. He didn't see the beautiful golden leaves fluttering down from the tree as it was the beginning of the autumn season. But his eyes followed the little path that was behind the iron gate, and he saw a little chapel, rather dilapidated. But he realized that this poplar tree was a suitable place for him to set up his accoutrements. So tethering his donkey to the fence that was beside the iron gate, he started to unpack the ragged knapsacks that hung on the side of his donkey. And he took out whistles and bells and discs and his costume. And as he was putting on his worn garments, that little vest with the gold thread in it, and his purple pants, and his pointed shoes with the bells on them, people, the townspeople, began to look and wonder what was happening. And one of the townspeople, the merchant, said, "Oh, an entertainer." And so the young man, setting up his wares, his bells, he took out his flute and he played a little tune that got the children to gather around. And then he began to juggle. He juggled the discs of all different colors with ribbons attached to them that danced in the breeze. And people started to gather around. And so he went in to the rest of his act, so well practiced over the years. And the people were mesmerized, especially the children, who loved to see the fluttering ribbons of all different colors as the discs spun in the air. He'd already put out the wooden bowl that was for the donations from those who could afford to play. But as he was coming to the end of his act, all of a sudden, the chapel bell began to ring, and one woman, taking the hand of her little boy, said, "Come, come, it's now time to go to the church service." And placing a couple of coins in the entertainer's wooden bowl, she led her son through the gate and down the little path that led to the church. And other people followed, until finally there was only one merchant left in the street. The merchant went over to the young entertainer and said, "Good show, young man," and put a couple of coins into his wooden bowl. Well, our young man started to pack up his wares, his discs, his ribbons, his bells, his knives that he juggled. But as he was packing his worn knapsacks, the sounds of the lilting voices of the hymns sung by the people reached his ears and entered into a deep, empty space in his heart. So instead of untying his donkey, he turned and was about to enter the gate and go down the path when he saw a young woman, prematurely old, hurrying with a worried look on her face towards the gate. As she entered the gate, she shook off her dusty skirt and patted her bedraggled hair into place, straightening her blouse, and hurried down the pathway to the church door. And our entertainer followed, and he sat in a pew right at the back, while the old priest waved the incense and gave his service. After the service was finished, the old priest, with great humility, greeted all the parishioners as they filed down the very short aisle of this small chapel. The entertainer noticed that the bedraggled woman who he'd seen coming down the path lingered, standing under the statue of the Virgin Mary, and very reverently placing her fingers to her lips and kissing them, she placed the kiss at the bottom of the statue. The entertainer stayed in his seat as all the parishioners left, and when the old priest had finished his greetings, he came in to see the young man sitting there. So he went over to him and sat beside him, and he said, "You look like a traveler on the road." And the young man nodded. "Where do you come from?" said the priest. And the young man said, "From everywhere. I travel the roads from village to village, doing my act to entertain the people." With great compassion, the old priest looked at the young man and said, "Oh, that must be a very lonely life." And those words seemed to pierce the shell that the young man had built so carefully around him, and entered that lonely, deep, empty space in his soul, and tears rolled down his face. The old priest looked at the young man and said, "You're very young to be so weary and sad. Why don't you stay with me a while?" Now the young man was greatly taken aback by this, and he looked and gazed carefully at the old priest, and he could see that the old man was genuine. And so he said, yes, I will. But what will I do?" And the old priest said, "Well, I have a garden that needs to be tended. Perhaps you will help me to tend my vegetables." So the young man went out and untethered his donkey and brought it in to the barn beside the manse that was nestled behind the church near the cemetery ground. And in the days that followed, the old priest took the young man out and showed him the ways of the garden. Now it had been many, many years since this young traveler had noticed the things of nature. His eyes focused on the possibilities of making enough money to give him some food and lodging for the night. And so to place his hands in the soil and tenderly pull the little potatoes, the large pumpkins, the cabbages, tenderly cutting the broccoli so that it could grow once again. He began to feel a relationship with the earth that had not been there for many, many years. One day, when he was tending the garden, along the path came the bedraggled woman that he'd seen entering the church on the first day, dragging a little scrawny, hungry-looking child beside her. She hurried past him to the door of the little manse and was greeted by the priest. She was carrying a gunny sack in her hand. And the priest greeted her with great tenderness, and then took her out into the garden and began to gather the potatoes, the cabbages, the carrots, the caul, and other vegetables that filled the little sack before she went on her way. And so the days went on for the young man, more and more feeling his relationship with the earth and enjoying the evenings with the old priest, sitting at the table eating the soup and bread that had been prepared, companionable. And then one evening, as they were sitting over the table, the old priest said to the young man, "Tell me your story." The young man began. He said, "My mother and father were entertainers. They too were jugglers and acrobats, and one amongst the troop taught me the ways of the trapeze, the balancing acts, the somersaults, and I was a good student. I learned well. And we traveled the countryside, being invited into the homes of rich people, entertaining them royally and being rewarded royally. But the ways of man are fickle, and even though we honed new skills, they grew tired of our acts and moved on to other entertainment. So we had to take to the road and entertain in the villages. But this was hard, and my mother grew sick and died. And then my father, mourning for her, also passed away. Our troop disbanded, and I was left alone. I traveled from place to place, but I found that my acrobats, my trapeze, my tight rope walking were not necessary. So I merely juggled my knives, my discs with ribbons attached. Oh, said the old priest, for those who don't care, you don't care to entertain. A sad frown came on the young man's face. And so he said, this is the way I lead my life. And what is your story? Said the young man. Oh, said the priest, from the very earliest age, I was longing for God. And my parents could see that I would not do well on the farm, so they sent me to a monastery where I practiced the rituals and the ways. But the abbot was wise, and he could see that my seeking and my quest was filled with pride and arrogance. And so one day, when an old priest came saying that he needed assistance in his parish, he sent me along with him to be his assistant. And there I learned the ways of people, their needs, their sorrows, their cares. So when I went back to the monastery, I completed my ordination, and I went from parish to parish serving until some years ago I was brought here, and here I serve. Some time later, the days were getting shorter. There was a chill in the air, so our young man was not able to tend the vegetables. It was becoming fallow. He spent more time in the chapel, cleaning, dusting, changing the candles that had wept over the edges of their holders, brushing the statues, and often his gaze would rest on that of the Virgin, standing there with the babe in her arms, looking so austere and sad. But as the days grew longer, one day the young man went to the priest and said, "Oh, there's a buzz in the air. A lot of the townspeople are coming into the church." "Oh," said the old priest, "it's coming to Christmas time." and the people are being prepared for the celebration. They bring gifts to the Virgin Mary. As the young man was dusting the church, in fact, cleaning the statue, he suddenly had a thought. People bringing gifts. And he could see the adornments that were already starting to gather, little bundles of pine cones, little twigs made into a flower basket. And he hastened out into the barn, and he cleared all the straw that was littered on the floor. He stretched his arms up above him and did a somersault. His muscles, although stiff, made the movements almost effortlessly, and he cartwheeled and gyrated around the barn. Every day after this, after he'd completed his chores, he went to the barn and practiced. And soon he was as adept as he'd been so long ago, and not so long ago. And then it came for the evening, when the parishioners gathered. And after the service, a beautiful service given by the priest in his vestments, the incense burning, the candles lit, the parishioners were invited to bring their gifts to lay them at the feet of the Virgin Mary. One by one they came, their little bundles, a few grains of wheat from a farmer's, a little basket of twigs with fruit inside. And so it went on, until the only one left was our young man. There was silence in the chapel as he walked down the aisle, and everyone looking with expectation, because he had nothing in his hands. And all of a sudden, standing in front of the statue, he somersaulted, and then he bounced and turned and whirled. The people were aghast. "This is entertainment. This doesn't belong in a church," they whispered. But the old priest came down from the altar and stood beside the entertainer as he whirled and turned and somersaulted. And then all of a sudden, a young voice from in the middle of the chapel said, "Look, look, the Virgin Mary is smiling." And everyone turned to look, and there she was, a gentle smile turning her mouth, her cheeks puffed out and rosy, her eyes glistening. She was smiling. Everyone was in awe. But our young man didn't notice until the priest touched him gently on the shoulder, and he stopped his somersaulting. And as the old priest turns and pointed, there he too saw the smiling face of the Virgin Mary statue. A miracle, it was said, and a miracle it was. From that time on, many people came to the village. The chapel became known as the Chapel of the Smiling Virgin. A troupe of entertainers came through the town, and our young man, our entertainer, followed them again onto the road. But every season he came back to the church to bow and present his act in front and with reverence. In my own life, in the very early years, and this I've never told anyone, I used to write poetry. I used to wake up in the middle of the night and I'd write poetry, line after line, page after page. But then, slowly, the shadows and the veils came down, and I had the awareness that no one wanted to listen to what I had to say. So it stopped. The poetry ceased flowing. And not long after that, I started to have a dream. I would dream that I could play a wonderful piece of music on a piano. But in my dream, when I went to the piano and lifted the lid, there was no keyboard. That dream became a nightmare. I would wake up sweating because I would be in a room that was filled with organs and pianos, and every one that I went to play, it had no keyboard. This dream and nightmare went on for many years. Is this story your story? Is this story like your story? Or do you have your own story? Even though knowing that every story told contains aspects, elements of ourselves, we do have an individual story. We have our own story, isn't it? Do you dare? Do you need the elements of this story to bring about your ability to express? To somersault? To gyrate? To dance? What's your story? How do you express it? Are you still impeded? Do you still have veils? Do you still have a dream indicating that there's unexpressed abilities, power, talents? What's your story? What's your story?